regulatory board, many governments will sue companies if they're charging too high prices or abusively high prices, and that is basically an example of average cost, sort of forcing implicitly companies to do average cost pricing. Anytime the government sort of goes after overly profitable firms, that's going to sort of force them to reduce their profits and come closer to average cost pricing. Okay, now average cost pricing can arise not just from explicit government regulation, but also from free entry. Because if anyone can come into an industry and there's free entry, then firms are not going to be able to sustain prices that are above their average costs, right? So in order for there to be free entry, of course, as we talked about earlier in the course, there has to be a large number of sort of equally capable managers for firms. They have to have easy access to capital, and sort of entering the industry, it has to not require any particular talent. It can't be rocket science. There have to be no barriers to entry. But in this case, anytime a firm is earning some profits, that'll attract entrants, and that will drive prices down to average costs, right? So average cost pricing can arise absent regulation just from free entry. And that's one reason that people often think that, or tend to model the insurance industry, assuming it doesn't have too many barriers to entry, as average cost pricing. This is a very common assumption in economic models. Perhaps not so realistic when there's heterogeneity in firms, but it's often a useful benchmark way of looking at things. So competition, in many cases, may mimic average cost pricing. Okay. Now, the key point is that because average costs are not equal to marginal costs, there's a distortion from average cost pricing. In particular, whenever marginal cost pricing will lead to losses, that means that average cost is above marginal cost, right? And therefore, average cost pricing will lead to a higher price than marginal cost. And therefore, there will be too little production at the average cost price, right? This is not dissimilar to monopoly pricing, but it's not as extreme. Why is that? Because the monopolist will always charge a price that's above the average cost, right, in order to try to earn some profits. So the wedge here is going to be the difference between average cost and marginal cost rather than the wedge between price and marginal revenue. And we can calculate things using the standard Harburger triangle, right, rather than having that wedge of marginal surplus times wedge of marginal surplus, which is P prime times quantity. Here, it's going to be the difference between average cost and marginal cost, which is equal to the slope of the average cost curve times quantity. Because remember that the marginal cost curve drags the average cost curve. If you work out the math, you get that it's the negative of the slope of the average cost curve times quantity, which is the marginal distortion created by average cost pricing. So again, like we analyzed the monopoly problem where we had P prime times Q, we said that things were proportional to the size of the market times sort of how much the quantity moves when the price moves when the quantity moves. Similarly here, it'll be proportional to the size of the market times the slope of the average cost curve, right? Now remember that it's possible to have a natural monopoly where the marginal cost is greater than the average cost, right? Remember we drew that picture last time where over some range the average cost curve was declining, but then it started to come back up again. If we had demand here, right, we would still just have a natural monopoly because it would always be less efficient to have firms that were half as big, two firms which are half as big, right? And so in this case, the marginal cost will actually be above the average cost. And in that case, average cost pricing could actually cause too much production rather than too little production, right? OK. So the standard distortion from average cost pricing comes in the case of economies of scale. So if we have a declining average cost curve, we'll have a marginal cost curve that lies even below the average cost curve, and we'll have a distortion arising from pricing at average cost, right? This Harburger triangle here. But while that's sort of the classical distortion, perhaps even more important distortions arising from average cost are the fact that the firm might not enter the industry at all, even though it's socially valuable. This is also sometimes called market collapse. Eric Anderson, how can that happen? Why might that happen?
How the demand curve crosses the marginal cost curve, right?
Uh-huh.
If it crosses from this, we'll get kind of moving to an inefficient, but if it crosses like this, then it'll unravel.
Yeah, that's right. So let's show that on a graph. Imagine that the average cost curve lies above the marginal cost curve, but the demand curve lies in between the two of them, right? Now notice that this market should exist, right? Because the demand curve, assuming there's no fixed costs in this case, the demand curve is always above the marginal cost curve. And that means that we should get all this area in surplus. And yet the market doesn't exist. Why doesn't the market exist? Well, imagine that the quantity were this. Well, then we would do average cost pricing, and the price would be here. But that would cause the quantity to go down to here. And then we would have average cost here, and so forth. And the market would collapse, even though it would be socially beneficial for the market to exist. Right? OK. So one other way to see this is you can construct what's called the average utility curve. What's the average utility curve? Well, it's the total utility in the market divided by the quantity. Now, that has the same relationship to the demand curve that the marginal cost curve, it is the same relationship to the demand curve that the demand curve has to the marginal revenue curve. That is, say, in the linear case, it's going to be half as steep as the demand curve is, right? And so if the demand curve was lying in between these two, the average utility curve would be lying up here. And whether the market should be created or not is determined by whether the average utility is greater than the average cost, right? And because the average utility is always above the average cost curve, that says that no matter what the quantity in the market is, it would be valuable for this market to exist. And yet it doesn't, right? OK. And the way that you can see that the average utility curve has the same relationship to the demand curve that the demand curve has to the marginal revenue curve is that if you multiply the average utility curve by the quantity, then you just have the utility curve, right? And the derivative of the utility with respect to quantity is the price by the envelope theorem, right? OK. So when average cost pricing causes a failure to entry, this is sometimes called market collapse or a death spiral. OK. Now, what is the distortion if marginal cost is above average cost? Jim, we just talked about that before, but can you spell that out, what that would do?
So if marginal cost is above average cost, so you're forcing average cost pricing.
Yeah.
There's a loss of potential surplus to the firm there. And demand, they're going to be producing too much.
Yeah.
As in the case of the other, they're producing too little.
Exactly. So with natural monopolies, we said marginal cost may be above average cost at equilibrium if we're in the subadditivity but not economies of scale case. And this is even more common in cases when free entry is forcing prices down to average cost. Because in this case, we'll end up with excessive or oversupply of the market. And we get the opposite Harberger triangle. So it's this picture here. If the average cost is here, and prices are forced down to average cost by free entry, but the marginal cost is up here, then you get a distortion from average cost pricing because there's actually too much supply to the market rather than too little, because the marginal cost curve is above the average cost curve. Yeah, go ahead, James.
Can you explain to us why this case where the demand curve is between the average cost and the marginal cost curve rather than just there. A monopoly doesn't seem like. If I had an unregulated monopoly, I wouldn't be producing in this market either, would I?
No, you wouldn't.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
So in average cost pricing will lead to market collapse, but so will monopoly. And in fact, that's the next slide that we're going to do. So the one other thing I wanted to show you first is imagine that there was a fixed cost in this market. Then, OK, so notice that here we could just determine that the market should be created without drawing the average utility curve, just by the fact that the demand was above the marginal cost. But if we had a fixed cost of creating this market, well, then the average cost curve would not be just the integral of the difference between these, right? We'd have to actually look at the average cost curve and compare it to the average utility curve to figure out whether there's a point that we get to when the average cost curve dips below the average utility curve, and therefore the market's worth creating. So if we have this fixed cost, then only if we can make the market sufficiently large is it going to be worth creating the market. OK, having the firm enter into the industry. OK. So clearly, average cost pricing is not an ideal solution. But a natural question, which James was starting to raise, is it better than an unregulated monopoly? And Daiichi, what do you think? Is average cost pricing better or worse than an unregulated monopoly?
Shouldn't it depend on how much information we have?
Well, let's put that all aside. Let's just think purely about the static distortion. Imagine that we could just costlessly mandate average cost monopoly, or average cost pricing, or unregulated monopoly. Which would be better?
Would it be average cost pricing?
Well, in some cases, but what do you guys think? I don't know. Is it always going to be the case? Anyone have a case where it might not? Yeah, Vershank.
Well, doesn't it depend on like where your average cost is? Because like the monopoly maximizes revenue at the marginal cost equal to MR, and MR
Yeah.
is going to be less than price.
Yeah.
So don't you, if your average cost is sort of less than your marginal cost, meaning that it's going to be less
Yeah.
than price, then it's not necessarily better.
Yeah, that's right. So that's very good analysis for Shunk. So let's try to go through that visually. So to the extent that there's under provision, right? To the extent that you have a declining marginal and average cost curve, so that there's under provision even under perfect competition, right? Then you were absolutely right, Daiichi. Because we want to try to get as much provision as possible, right? And the monopolist is always going to produce less than average cost pricing would lead to, right? So if the problem is under provision, you definitely want average cost pricing. But Vershank pointed out that we can, of course, both under natural monopoly and even more under free entry, end up with a case where marginal cost is greater than average cost, right? And in that case, there's going to be too much production, right? And on the other hand, as Vershank was pointing out, the monopoly is going to underproduce, right? Because he's going to choose a point where price is greater than marginal cost, right? And given that marginal cost is greater than average cost, that will clearly lead to too little production, right? Much less production than would happen under free entry or average cost pricing. But given that the optimum is somewhere in between, it's not clear whether monopoly or free entry / average cost pricing is better, right? So in the classical case that we usually think of in terms of regulation, where we have just declining marginal and average cost over the full range, it's true that average cost pricing is better. But even from a static perspective, it's not obviously better if we have an increasing marginal and average cost curve. Yeah, Vershank.
Maybe I just don't understand this, but
Yeah.
can you give me some concrete examples of monopolies where the marginal costs are greater than
Well,